It is my absolute sincere pleasure, thank you, to introduce the current president of IPrA, Marina Sbisà, an eminent and leading voice in pragmatics and specifically, as I'm sure you all know, speech-act theory. Marina hails from Trieste in the northeast of Italy, where she obtained a degree in philosophy in 1971 at the University of Trieste, and where she worked her entire career and served as full professor, professore ordinario, is that how you pronounce it? Yes, in philosophy and theory of languages until 2018. At the University of Trieste, she also notably coordinated the Interdepartmental Center for Research on Mind and Language. She's held visiting professorships and fellowships at Magdalen College in Oxford, Fuji's Women's University in Japan, the University of Amiens and CNRS in France, and New College in Oxford. She is an honorary member of the editorial board of the Journal of Pragmatics and also an editorial board member of Lott's papers in Pragmatics. And she is a long-standing and respected member of the consultation board of IPrA. Her publications are numerous, far too many to cite or fully represent in the little time I have here today for this introduction. But they include 4 single-authored monographs, 7 edited volumes, and approximately, I didn't count them, so it's approximately 160 articles and book chapters. Notably, in 2024, Oxford University Press published her most recent monograph titled Austinian Themes, Elocution, Action, Knowledge, Truth and Philosophy. And in 2023, they published her Essays on Speech, Act and Other Topics in Pragmatics, which is a collection of essays which gathers her most influential writings spanning an impressive 4 decades from 1984 until 2020, specifically on her signature deontic conventional approach to elocutionary force. Her work and production of knowledge is not only enormous in terms of volume, but is also exceptionally widely cited and influential internationally. Now, beyond her many scholarly achievements, I personally have come to know Marina as a warm person, as a kind person, but also a very funny person and a very inquisitive person, someone whose keen, dedicated eye for detail, preciseness, and rigor not only applies to her academic work, but equally to the less or the maybe not so academic aspects of life. For example, her carefully thought out and planned care of the plants and the flora in her garden, or her rigorous study of restaurant menus before making a well-decided, well-considered and motivated choice of which dish exactly she will eat at that time. It's true, huh? So with that, please join me all in warmly welcoming Marina for her presidential address.
The title of my presidential address, as you can see here, is Action in Pragmatics. In connection with the special topic of this conference, Pragmatics in Action, what I would like to offer is, of course, not an overview of all work done on action in all branches of pragmatics, but some clarifications and reflective thoughts on the role of the notion of action in the context of pragmatic research. Attention for action, by the way, is a founding character of pragmatics. Pragma means action, things done, think done. As to language, pragmatics can therefore be viewed as a speech as action perspective. And also, research on multimodal social interaction, I think, can profit from focus on action as opposed to, for example, transfer of information. Transfer of information itself would profit of being, more and more considered as a kind of actions. specific kind of action. But what is action? The notion of action has two facets: activity and responsibility. We have to deal with both, but responsibility, even though now sometimes foregrounded under the name of accountability, is still little understood. By the way, agency too is a mixture of these two facets, because to have agency, we have to become active, we have to activate ourselves some way. And in agency, we make ourselves accountable for what we do in acting. Anyway, I'll not speak of agency in this talk because already action is enough. Agency is, strictly connected with action. We can perhaps come to the connection in the discussion. There will be some, I hope there will be. The two facets of action, activity and responsibility, do not always proceed parallel. Sometimes one of them is highlighted and sometimes the other, both in theory and in practice in actual life. What does activity mean? Activity is an agent's being active, acting in some way. Act, in one sense of the word, is a move within an activity. The word act is often used, the word activity is often used to mean, I think it's emotion. I went wrong in reading my slide. Okay. The word act is often used to mean an element of active versus passive behavior, the doing of something. Most philosophical theories of action consider action in this respect. In the philosophy of action, going back to Davidson, actions are reduced to moves in a behavioral activity that is bodily movements caused by appropriate mental states, such as intentions and beliefs. Actions, in that perspective, are therefore something that depends entirely on the individual's being active. There is only one and only one action at every stage of an agent's behavior, and it consists of a bodily movement appropriately caused. What comes later are consequences and descriptions of them. The influence of Davidson's philosophy of action is still visible in recent philosophy, notwithstanding the efforts of some philosophers, such as Jennifer Hornsby, to foster alternative views. It extends to recent speech act theory, so that, for example, Michael Kissin in 2013 takes the standard theory of action for granted. The standard theory of action is a name that has been given by critics to Davidson theory. Now, responsibility. Before Davidson, Austin took a very different stance in which the notion of responsibility emerges as central. Acts and/or actions are the bringing about of an effect for which the agent is responsible. Action identification is the ascription of the responsibility for the effect. Actions are therefore not to be identified with physical things we do one after the other. Our life is not made of a series of actions as bodily movements caused by our inner states. The action is ascribed to the agent on the basis of the agent's prima facie role in bringing about a certain effect. So if you see, that I dropped this pen, you see that. And it is clear to you that I opened my hand and the pen fell down. The ascription of the action involves an attribution of responsibility for that effect. So if you have seen me to do that, you can and should, you are completely justified in ascribing to me the responsibility for dropping the pen. And the ascription of the action, but the description of the action is also defeasible to varying degree if it turns out that extenuating circumstances hold. Suppose I had some sudden pain in my hands and had to open my hand because of that pain, or suppose that I was going to faint and I opened my hand because of that. You don't ascribe me responsibility for dropping the pen. Or at any rate, I can explain I didn't mean that there was something else that happened to me and it wasn't really an action of mine. So just doing something does not amount to performing an action. There are doings that can hardly be considered as actions. For example, a case discussed by Austin and responded to very polemically by other philosophers is the case of yawning. Is that an action? It is the doing of something. It is a bodily movement. You are aware you are yawning, but is that an action? Does it make sense to inquire whether it is intentional or unintentional? If you did it on purpose or not? If you just sit down and are sleepy and yawn, what's that? So I think it's a doing, but it's not clear whether it is an action. It could be viewed as an action under certain circumstances, but usually we don't think of it as an action. If one considers acts, an act can also be an action. The same happening, so to say, the same bringing about of a change in the world may be an act and also an action. But the act has to be viewed not as a move in an activity, a step in the execution of an activity, but as the bringing about of an effect, which means as an action core, the core of an action. In action identification, the effect comes first and the agent second, being identified as the subject who is responsible or can reasonably be attributed responsibility for that effect. What makes an action real, then, is not the individual agent with his or her mental machinery, but undefeated action ascription. According to Austin, responsibility is a central notion for the philosophical conception of action on a par with freedom, but with a different role. But he says little about that, apart from using the idea in his discussion of excuses in the famous paper, A Plea for Excuses, which also contains a methodological statement by him. Responsibility is to be understood here in the simple causal sense without legal or moral implications. When we speak of responsibility, there is often the feeling that we are going towards moral or legal matters, but there can also be a lower level of this notion, more general, just having caused something, just being responsible for something your behavior brought about. Responsibility is also one of the facets of the complex notion of accountability, which also involves the capability and willingness to account for the act or action one has performed. When we speak of accountability, I think we often have in mind the fact that in a framework of rationality, everyone is bound to account for what they say and do. And this is a step further with respect to sheer responsibility. But it's very important in the context of pragmatic analysis of interaction. So now some few words about acts, actions, and activities. The relation between the notions of act, action, and activity is in need of clarification. The words are often used kind of random way, and the relation is not clear. I think it is a matter of aspectual perspective. You who are linguists know better than me what aspect is. Act is a perfective notion because an act is viewed as a unit without internal articulation. Just an act, a thing done. Activity is imperfective and atelic. It is viewed in its internal articulation, but without an ending point. Can go on the same activity as long as you make it go, and it can be cyclic, goes in cycles, for example. Action is imperfective as much as activity, but is telic, because it's viewed in its internal articulation as a process of bringing about an effect, but with an ending point, that effect, that result. Act, if connected to activity, is a step in the activity, as I said before, but if connected to action, it is the thing done, the core of the action. And when we pass from act to action, we pass from the perfective perspective, in which we only look at the thing done as if it were a unit, to the process that is that presupposes a whole narrative framework. In a narrative, the main action is the accomplishment of a task by the hero or heroine. The hero or heroine undertakes the task spurred by desire to achieve some goal, often remedy an initial state of lack or loss, or prompted by some duty or obligation they are assigned. They will successfully accomplish the task if they have got the ability and the knowledge that the task requires. Once the task is accomplished, or the hero or heroine fails to accomplish it, the last phase of the narrative provides a sanction. The hero or heroine is acknowledged or not as carrying out their task, and if they carried out the task, did they do it correctly? Reward and punishment may follow. So we have this kind of elements in the narrative framework for action. But we find those things again and again also in speech acts, in conversations, and so on. When we take an action perspective, when we focus on some thing that is done, framing it as an action. The link between act and action is broken when the act is considered as a mere move within a stretch of activity. In that case, its effect is backgrounded or ignored, and every resulting state of affairs or event is seen as one of the consequences of the act. I conclude these considerations saying that the performance of an action should be analyzed as the execution involving various activities of a complex script achieving a final result. So, there are two dimensions in research concerned with actions: studying kinds of effects and how they are brought about and identified and ascribed. Studying the activities that are involved in the carrying out of the script that constitutes the performance of the action. I have now a number of random remarks about actions that I can perhaps go through rather rapidly, but you show me when it is the time you show me. Okay. I said that studying kinds of effect is one of the things that has to be done with respect to actions. Okay, kinds of acts can be distinguished on the basis of the kinds of effect that are constitutive of them. This is what the locutionary, perlocutionary distinction is about in the case of language. These acts have effects of different kinds. What Austin said about that distinction is that the various flaws or failures that the speech act considered in its entirety may suffer from correspond to the specific effect that this locutionary, perlocutionary layer would have had in default conditions. So if you see that something is missing, then you understand that that act or action should have had a certain component. But this is a methodological suggestion of starting from flaws, defects, failures in order to understand standard and smooth ways of doing things. Because if you start from what is normal, then there is no end, because you cannot describe all the conditions that make a situation normal. There is no end to describing normality, but you can be more specific about the components of a situation, of an event, or an action, if you look at situations in which there are flaws, defects. Anyway, kinds of effects, in my opinion, can also be distinguished observing what they affect and how they are brought about. Second theme, there are a number of different themes in this last slide. An agent may be engaged in more than one activity at the same time, as most of you, those who make applied analysis, will know. Each of those activity tracks is liable to give rise to an action if there is an effect and its bringing about is appropriately framed. A person, moreover, may not be one agent. They may be split into different roles. For example, Goffman's participation roles as animator, author, and principal. And they may also not amount to an agent, any agent, while carrying out activities, the agent may be a collective one or an institution. So the individual carries on the activity, but the agent, the real agent responsible for the action, is the collective agent or the institution on behalf of which the person, the individual person, is carrying out his or her activities. Now, action pluralism. Is it possible for an action to have more than one effect? I would say no. An action may be characterized by a complex effect, but the relation is one-to-one. One action, one effect, however complex. But a stretch of activity may have more than one effect and therefore constitute the performance of more than one action. You handed out a small package to a child, you gave the child a gift. Is it one action or two? Elocution and perlocution. A ordered B to do something versus A made B do that thing. A told B that tomorrow it will rain versus A made B believe that tomorrow it will rain. All those things I cited, acts I cited, can be viewed as actions, and some of them coincide as to the execution of activity. There is no more activity in perlocution than there is in elocution. No more activity. But there is another effect that is framed as the main action when we look at it. Now, action as sequence dependent. Acts come in sequences. One kind of sequence is the three places sequence consisting of initiative move, a move responding to it, and a further move providing an assessment of reward. This is the same thing as the narrative framework of action I illustrated beforehand. That threefold structure highlights a second move as the main action. This is one way in which acts are actions, but none of them can be actions in the same time, at the same time, since their being actions depends on the position in the sequence. Of course, the punctuation of the sequence can be shifted if we want to consider each act in its full role as an action. So sometimes we have to shift our consideration of things, but every act, if it has to be considered as an action, has to be framed at least between the preceding situation or act and the following one. Action is also interaction dependent. Some actions achieve their effects thanks to the collaboration of others. They have been called joint actions, but in some cases at least, responsibility for them belongs to their agent versus the helpers. It is so, for example, with those speech actions, elocutionary ones, that require tacit or explicit agreement in order to be effective. There is some sort of joint action in that case, but still the agent is the speaker. The others help or hinder the speaker for achieving, accomplishing their action. The interactional dependency of action is most apparent in the case of conventional actions, actions having conventional effects, including elocution. Action ascription, in their case, it is itself an action, thinks it can make a difference, and the agent that performs it is accountable for it. Action ascription, however, is also relevant to non-conventional actions. Standard actions, material action we perform. The ascription of those actions too is divisible and can be negotiated. It's divisible you know, if circumstances are brought up that mitigate the agent responsibility or even cancel it. Now, action and intention. Being intentional, I think, is the default status of action, and it is questioned only in case of doubt. We assume that people know approximately what they are up to, and this is enough to ascribe them the intention of doing what we see them as doing. And even more so if the thing done is framed as an action. Anyway, the agent may attempt not to have done something by proffering excuses, among which lack of intention, thus negotiating the action ascription with other participants and sometimes managing to get it modified or cancelled. But there may also be cases in which, albeit an agent didn't do something unintentionally, they remain responsible. Sorry, albeit an agent did something unintentionally, they remain responsible for the action that is ascribed to them, insofar as that action ascription is well grounded. And perhaps this happens in particular when the agent, for some reason, is obliged, has an obligation or a commitment to do something. A failure in that task cannot be cancelled so easily just by saying, well, I didn't intend, because you should have intended. Okay, last but one also. Pragmatics is sometimes thought of as the realm of inferences. I prefer to think of it in terms of action, but let me recall that inferences are acts that our mind performs, at least as steps in our mental activity. And drawing a conclusion is an illocutionary act that can be performed in uttering a sentence in a certain linguistic and cognitive context, and can be considered both under the facet of activity and under that of responsibility. So the action approach to pragmatics can be considered as more inclusive. Now, pragmatics in action. Let us come back to the title of this conference and reflect a moment. Academic work is an activity, but does it give rise to action? Especially, does our work in pragmatics give rise to action? What action? What actions? Within what kind of a plan? What actions? With what effects on which, of which we can be held responsible? Is our way of dealing with languages, speech, interaction, cultures, something to which the notion of responsibility or accountability apply? I think it is so, and many of you are doing great, of course, within the limitation of academic work, and so is doing IPrA, to which I wish many other conferences at least as good as this one.